Good afternoon. Welcome to panel one of the Evidence Conference, Evidential Standards. My name is Kyle Roberts, and I'm the Associate Director of Library and Museum Programming at the American Philosophical Society. This is the first day of our APS virtual symposium, Evidence, the Use and Abuse of Data. I'm so glad that so many of you have joined us today. I hope some of you were able to join us for the keynote, which happened at 1 p.m. We're going to continue the conversation and think about many of the themes that were brought up in that panel. For those of you joining us for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. The society has long been a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who have made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts and humanities, and public life. The Society promotes research, providing over $1 million in research grants a year, primarily to younger scholars who need the support the most. Our library museum collections and research centers serve scholars and visitors from around the globe. The library and museum are currently closed because of the pandemic, but we're looking forward to opening in a few months. Given the many different ways that our founder, Benjamin Franklin, used evidence and information in his scientific research, publishing, and diplomatic work, we felt that this week's conference on the use and abuse of data in the past, present, and future would be particularly fitting. Before I introduce our speakers, let's go to the second slide, and let me just give you a little bit of background about how we're going to structure the format of today's talk. So we have three speakers for today, and I'm going to introduce them in a minute. Each will speak for 8 to 10 minutes about their work. Now, this is a conference with pre-circulated papers. So we're going to put in the chat box a link to those papers if you want to go to our website and download them. There you can get the full range of our scholars' arguments. After each presentation today, we're going to begin our conversation with just some quick thoughts, and I'll provide some questions to the presenters. Then we want to turn it over to questions from our audience. And to use that, to submit a question, and we hope you will, please use the Q&A feature that you can see at the very bottom of your screen on the Zoom navigation bar. So in case you're not familiar, we're in Zoom webinar mode right now, which means that you are all muted. So we can't hear you. You can't raise your hand and ask a question, but we do ask that you use the Q&A function. And we're going to try to get to as many questions as possible. Questions that get asked that you can't answer today, we're going to try to answer after the conference is over. We are recording this session, and we will be posting this on our website, so do check back. If you're particularly excited about some of the dialogue, some of the conversation you're hearing today, please use our social media channels. The conference hashtag is #APSEvidence, and we are on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. So try to continue the conversation there. But as I said, also give us your questions for today. We can go back to the first slide. I'll just give a quick overview. I think it's easier for me to introduce all three of our speakers from the start, and that way we can just sort of go right through their papers. Our first speaker is Angela Ray, who is an associate professor in the Communications Studies Department and associate dean for academic affairs in the graduate school at Northwestern University. Her scholarship and teaching focus on rhetorical analysis and rhetorical history, with specialties in 19th-century US popular education and social reform. Her paper is entitled Archival Profusion, Archival Silence, and Analytic Invention: Reinventing Histories of 19th-Century African-American Debate. The second paper is by Daniel Heller, who is a professor of history, distinguished professor in the humanities, and editor and director of the Papers of Andrew Jackson at the University of Tennessee. Feller and his team have produced 5 volumes of the Papers of Jackson, covering the presidential years from 1829 through 1833. His paper is entitled President Andrew Jackson, Fake Quotations, False Facts, and the Debasement of History. Our third presenter is Andrew Schocket, who is a professor of history and American culture studies at Bowling Green State University, where he studies and teaches early American history and culture, memory, and digital humanities. His paper is entitled Bunk History and the Standards of Historical Interpretation. So I'm going to go ahead and mute my screen and turn it over to our first speaker, Angela Ray.
You can show the next slide, please. Thank you very much, Kyle. In some ways, my paper continues the themes of the very productive keynote that we've just heard, as I invite us to think about the process of knowledge production in historical inquiry and to consider how we might best evaluate evidence, whether it is profuse, sparse, or absent. That is, how do we assess evidence in order to generate claims about what the past was like? Next slide, please. In the scholarly field of rhetoric and argumentation, the concept of evidence is malleable. We see evidence not as phenomena that can determine decisions directly, but as grounds for argument. And we understand argument as an interactive, culturally specific process of critical engagement that requires human judgment in order to generate decisions in conditions of uncertainty and variability. That is, evidence itself has persuasive force, and assessing the utility of evidence in grounding claims requires analyzing its provenance, the methods and purposes of its generation, and the characteristics of its producers and recipients. Historical study offers an especially good illustration of the necessary struggle with selecting and using evidence. So I'm briefly today going to discuss three of the challenges of historical evidence: adducing meaning from silence, managing intermittent narration, and constructing new questions from ambiguity. Next slide, please. I'm working on a book project about civic debating in the antebellum United States with a special focus on a group called the Cleonian Debating Society, which was founded and run by young, free African-American men in Charleston, South Carolina between 1847 and 1858. An unusually rich record of this group exists in two handwritten proceedings volumes, one held at the Charleston Library Society and the other at Duke University. After I saw these two volumes and perceived them to be extraordinarily significant, my first action was to transcribe their 50,000 word text, personally and in full, not only for the practical reason of creating a searchable file, but also in order to learn through performance about these young men's crafting of language, its cadences, its patterns, and its power. It is unusual to have comprehensive minutes for any antebellum debating society, and the context of this group's surroundings make these records compelling. Living in a state and a political climate in which it was illegal to teach reading to enslaved people, but also to free persons of color, these young men were sprinkling their carefully polished English prose with Latin phrases, debating the ongoing Crimean War in Europe, or praising their members for delivering speeches envisioning the evangelization of Africa. They focused attention on their own self-government. They collected books and pamphlets for a society library, and they wrote letters to local patrons and to supporters at a distance, including Charleston native Daniel Payne, then in Baltimore, who was soon to become bishop of the AME Church. Next slide, please. These minutes are rich and evocative, but at the same time reticent. Analyzing their silences, especially about questions pertinent to the time and with continuing exigence in our own time, requires adducing meaning from absence. For example, the minutes never use any racial descriptors, and terms like slavery, emancipation, and even the South do not appear. Why is that? Did they fear that their records might fall under the surveilling eyes of threatening enemies? Were they avoiding fostering ill will among themselves? Or did they want to practice debating questions that were less pressing, less connected to the ever-present culture of slavery? While scholarly speculation, taking into account the social and political context of the time, can produce plausible possibilities, we must accept our inability to know for sure. Next slide, please. Now, in addition to studying the activities of the Debating Society, I'm also trying to learn more about the people named in the proceedings. The minutes identify 54 members, honorary members, or supporters. That's 52 men and 2 women. Some of these people can be traced through the annals of other educational and benevolent societies, court records, newspaper archives, and government records. These sources are on paper, microfilm, or electronic databases. The body of evidentiary materials thus amassed is large but indiscriminate, with most information relating to institutional authority. Nonetheless, extant sources provide persuasive grounds to state that the society comprised young men, most in their teens and 20s. A few of them would serve in the Union Army. Others would be elected to Reconstruction-era state legislatures, and many would become ministers, school teachers, and skilled artisans, such as tailors and barbers. The amassed evidence of the members' later lives is the opposite of the evidence of the minute books. Whereas the minutes depict regular, ordinary activity in detail, later evidence of the members' lives is intermittent and sparse. Because we can locate evidence of individuals only at points in space and time, telling continuous narratives is not feasible. On the other hand, extant evidence is sufficient to make a persuasive case for the significance of an education in speaking, writing, reading, and debating in helping to produce the South's post-war Black male leadership. Next slide, please. Now, tracing lives connected to this society sometimes leads to evidentiary complexities that generate new questions. For example, Emma Farbeau is named in the minutes as a donor of money and books, including in 1850, 3 books by unidentified women writers. She also received formal letters of thanks from the society members, and she once facilitated the group's exchange of letters with Daniel Payne. The minutes routinely depict her as a revered benefactor. Now, searching for records of Farbeau's life produces evidence of other stories, including contradictions that crystallize the complexities of the lives of Black Americans in the late antebellum period. For example, her legal status at the time she was supporting the Charleston debaters is unclear. Was she domestic servant or enslaved captive? She had been born into slavery, and she had long lived in the household of a wealthy white widow who owned homes in Charleston and in Philadelphia and traveled seasonally between them. The dynamics of the household appear in public records because after the widow's death in 1852, the state of Pennsylvania sued her estate for taxes, and Emma Farbeau and her husband Jacob testified in 1856 in the U.S. Circuit Court in Philadelphia, bearing witness in the hall of the American Philosophical Society, which was then being rented by the court. Court records reveal the domestic responsibilities of Emma Farbeau, reading to the wealthy widow and writing letters for her, and they also reveal key dates of Emma's journey to Philadelphia in 1850. Emma and Jacob Farbeau would make a life for themselves in Philadelphia's free Black community after the widow's death. Jacob became first a barber and later a messenger for an iron foundry. Charlotte Fortin would record in her diary that while visiting the Farbeau home in 1858, quote, Mrs. Farbeau read to me the interesting account of the anti-slavery meetings. Now, the evidence for the life of Emma Farbeau at mid-century indicates her support for learning and her own productive literacy. Yet the precarity of her legal status, whether as slave or as servant, highlights the uncertainties of Black freedom in relation to law, labor, and interstate mobility. At the same time, these ambiguities throw into even higher relief the features of the Debating Society's minute books, which record a compelling assertion of freedom, self-respect, and self-determination. Next slide, please. Now, the details of this case offer support for claims critical to U.S. history about the recurrence of race-based oppression and trauma, as well as claims about the hope and promise of learning and the powerful goal of human freedom. More prosaically, they also call attention to the rhetorical qualities of scholarship itself. producing history is not just reporting evidence. Even the identification of a source as a resource for evidence represents an influential choice. So I would ask all of us, how are we selecting and interpreting and representing the past for our present? Thank you.
Hello?
We can hear you.
Can you see me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Before I start in, let me say that in the next few minutes, I'm going to deliver a broadside of allegations and accusations without offering much substantiation for them. And given that that's exactly what I'm accusing other people of doing, let me encourage you, if it seems like I'm saying things without backing them up, to read the paper online, which has all the evidence in it. I'm the editor and director of the papers of Andrew Jackson at the University of Tennessee, which is a long-running, federally supported project to collect and publish Andrew Jackson's entire extant literary record. Now, we at the project by no means consider ourselves as Jackson's defenders or guardians of his reputation. That's not our job. But we do attend to his appearance in contemporary public discourse, in part out of scholarly curiosity, but also because the stated goal of our work is to help elevate that discourse by providing a firm evidentiary record on which to ground it. It's therefore with puzzlement and misgiving that we have observed Jackson's newfound prominence over the last few years with the political rise of Donald Trump and the consequently reckless, wanton inaccuracy of much of what is nowadays said about Jackson on both sides of the political divide. History, like everything else, has become politicized, and historians and responsible journalists who once fancied themselves guardians of evidentiary standards have willfully taken part. Donald Trump invited us to see him through the lens of Andrew Jackson, and it seems that we have gone in one better or one worse. We now see Andrew Jackson through the highly distorting lens of Donald Trump. The president has said in nearly these exact words, "I'm just like Andrew Jackson. I'm a great popular hero, hated by the establishment, the insider elites and government bureaucrats, but loved by ordinary Americans." And the critics say, yes, you are just like Andrew Jackson. You're an ignoramus, a racist, a bigot, and a demagogue. And both sides have manipulated, distorted, and even falsified Jackson's actual record in order to sustain their point. Well, Jackson's outsized personality has always weighed more indelibly in Americans' minds than his policies have. We know Jackson best through his striking declamations. John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. One man with courage makes a majority. My only regret in life is that I did not shoot Henry Clay and hang John C. Calhoun. In fact, not one of these lines is authentic, yet they linger in memory precisely because they confirm an image of Jackson as a man of boldness and decision, or, viewed negatively, of impulsiveness and caprice. That image supports a conception of Jackson as a bold disruptor in world affairs, a practitioner of heavily militarized and defiantly unilateral diplomacy. Donald Trump himself, his admirers, and some of his critics have branded Trump's belligerent foreign policy postures, his embrace of tariffs, his sabotaging of international agreements and multinational organizations, his threats of armed force, as quintessentially Jacksonian. Yet none of these have any plausible antecedent or parallel in Andrew Jackson's actual presidential foreign policy. The idea of a belligerent Jacksonian worldview and policy has become utterly disconnected from the historical evidence on Jackson and his presidency. Yet this warping of history, largely perpetrated by admirers of Donald Trump, pales to that performed by his critics in the media and academia, who have unleashed charges against Andrew Jackson that range from oversimplified to boldly unhinged. The apparent underlying premise is that Jackson, like Trump, is such a bad guy that it's basically fair game to accuse him of anything. Feeding on the image of Jackson as having a vicious and uncontrollable temper, his career as a duelist has been wildly exaggerated. A cover story in Atlantic magazine by a professor at Northwestern University had Jackson fighting, quote, at least 14 duels in his life, unquote. Newsweek upped that number to 100 duels while simultaneously chastising Donald Trump for what it called his gaping and well-demonstrated ignorance of American history. Both of those numbers, 14 and 100, have been widely repeated. The actual number of formal duels that Jackson fought is 1. Jackson's notorious Indian removal policy is blameworthy enough on its merits, but critics are determined to make it worse. The New York Times charged that, and these are the Times' words, his decisions annihilated American Indian tribes of the Southeast, which is a bold exaggeration of both intent and result. Shedding nuance, complexity, and even basic accuracy, historians and journalists routinely and falsely characterize Jackson's policy as simply exterminationist or genocidal. Indeed, tagging Jackson as a violent racist facilitates dismissing all of his policies as impulsive and vindictive emanations of his irrepressible spleen. Drawing explicit parallels with Trump, writers in respected venues, including the Washington Post and New York Times, reduced Jackson's stand against South Carolina's nullification of the tariff or his opposition to the Bank of the United States to mere personal vendettas, despite vast evidence to the contrary. I find the reckless ignorance and inaccuracy of most current commentary on Jackson to be both troubling and mystifying. One wants to believe what one reads in the daily paper, especially when that paper is a supposed paragon of responsible journalism. With charges of fake news flying about, one would expect writers to attend more carefully to their facts, not less. Yet reporters who would not think to quote something that someone said yesterday without checking it for accuracy grab their history wherever they can get it. And historians, including some very big names, have done the same. A spate of reporting on Andrew Jackson's censure in 1834 by the United States Senate, an event with obvious contemporary parallels, offered a distressing example. The Senate censure consisted of a single sentence, single resolution, easily found in the public record. Nearly every story I saw got it wrong, many of them absurdly so. Well, analogies between Andrew Jackson and Donald Trump have subsided of late, and one is tempted to say good riddance. As Trump has become better known in his own right, the impulse to plug the gap in our comprehension by finding someone else to compare him to has receded. Furthermore, Jackson's presidency offers little by way of instruction on dealing with pandemic disease, which has been a pressing concern in recent weeks. Still, Jackson's invocation in political controversy on both sides speaks ominously for the quality of American public discourse. Distortion and misrepresentation in the heat of partisan debate are, of course, not new. But historians and responsible journalists who consult with them are supposed to be above that. They purport to uphold a higher standard. And yet in propagating a cartoon image of Jackson, they have been among the worst offenders. Vending errors that could very easily be checked, they have added their might to the idea that truth doesn't matter as long as you're on the right side, a dangerous notion no matter who espouses it. Lost in the tinny Jackson caricatures that have been offered up for public consumption are subtlety, nuance, complexity, ambiguity, even basic accuracy, the very things that historians claim to cherish and to strive for in their writing. In their willingness to subordinate scholarship to current political ends, critics have in fact made themselves exemplars of the very traits for which they often condemn Andrew Jackson: ignorance, vitriol, and a penchant for shooting from the hip. Their example poses a disturbing question. If we who claim to know the past will not take more care with our facts, then who will do it for us? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to Kyle and especially to Adriana for all the work that you've done to organize these conversations. I'm going to start with a report issued in 2014 by the American Civil Rights Union, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that sees itself as a counterbalance to the ACLU. That report was called "The Truth About Jim Crow." Now, I think, certainly especially at this moment, the more we think about Jim Crow and its terrible legacies, the better, but not this way. The report had leaps of logic, and worse, ignored or claimed evidence didn't exist, despite it being in the sources that the report cited. Lest we think that this is only something that happens when lay people perform history, I'll bring up the case of Michael Belisle's 1996 article, The Origins of Gun Culture in the United States, 1760 to 1865, published in the Journal of American History. Now, some of you may be familiar with the brouhaha that followed that concerning charges of potential fabrication, but we can see included in the evidence printed with that article, regardless of where of what the sources were, right printed in the article, quite obviously, mathematical improbabilities or impossibilities and contradictions that begged for explanation or undermined the article's thesis. Now, these have generally been interpreted as individual failures. And yet, when they were released, they were lauded and rewarded. In fact, Belisle's got that journal's annual award for its best article. And I would argue that these were not deviations from standard historical practice, but rather perhaps extreme, but nonetheless occasionally almost inevitable outcomes resulting from historical practice in the United States, really relating to two interlocking flaws in how we historians evaluate each other's arguments. One is we have a lack of explicit measures of burdens of proof for evidence or levels of confidence in correlation. I think this comes from our liberal arts heritage, because to do so, I think we might think is perhaps too formulaic. And yet, despite history being inherently ideological, which we recognize, there's a lack in the discipline of consideration of confirmation bias. And maybe this is due to our social science heritage, for our striving for objectivity, even recognizing that it's not possible. Now, by the way, neither of these ideas are new to the profession, although I haven't seen them considered much in tandem, which is why I want to talk about them in this way. Oh, by the way, how certain am I? You asked, since I said we don't apply these measures. Well, neither of these sets of criteria are given much of any consideration in the history methodology books that we assign to our own undergraduates. So how we socialize historians, nor are either of these given any consideration in the instructions that we give to manuscript reviewers for top academic journals in the field, so we don't practice them. And at times, this combination can lead to systemic failures. And let me give you one example. And this is regarding the evaluation of what's commonly called the Iroquois influence thesis, which is the argument that the practice of the Haudenosaunee Six Nations may have inspired the Albany Plan of Union, and thus the idea of federalism, that is, having a national government made up of at least semi-sovereign local governments. And by the way, I am in no way arbitrating that debate here, merely talking about what I observed in nearly every piece I read, either proponents, opponents, or just evaluating the claim. Almost none of them considered levels of certainty or levels of correlation. And almost all of them, again, on all sides, offered ad hominem attacks, suggesting that others did not see the evidence in the sources that they consulted, or that others' logic was so flawed that they were practicing bad history. And yet, these were all works that were published in professional venues. And so they all apparently met our standards for what we require of good historians, good historical practice. And that's something to think about, but I think it's especially important in this moment. And I think about the parallels between history and what's often referred to as the first draft of history, that is journalism, which is certainly undergoing a crisis. And we can see some of the debates bubbling up there, as some of you may have read some of the debates among historians about the New York Times 1619 project. And when we think about history and journalism, both in some ways attempt perhaps to get at the truth, but both also have a goal of objectivity that's historically situated, that we need to historically situate this, that comes from a late 19th century that helped them make claims to professionalization in the United States in the late 19th century, sort of as the ultimate extension of Enlightenment assumptions about rationality, and for both reached an apotheosis in post-World War II period, expressed in positive terms at the time as consensus, but we could also argue may also have just been a manifestation of the suppression, intentional or unintentional, of dissenting ideas and diverse voices. And we're finally better seeing the consequences of some of these silences and suppressions. And so maybe we, as journalists, but certainly as historians, maybe we need different frames of thinking about how we evaluate arguments and about our claims to objectivity, and maybe getting rid of that frame of objectivity to think about how we evaluate arguments, especially those that normally we might not be so hospitable to, but we need to hear. Thank you.
All right, we're gonna go ahead and bring our three wonderful speakers back on. All right, hopefully everybody is now unmuted. Good. So thank you for these great papers. I realize it's always a challenge to take 15 to 20 pages of wonderfully written text and to say it really quickly, but you've all done a really great job, I think, of expressing the real core of the arguments that you make in the longer papers. And what I particularly appreciate is how you're wrestling with the challenge of what we understand as evidence from different disciplinary perspectives, right? So we have, you know, how this might look like from rhetoric communication studies, how it might look like from traditional academic history, but also how it might look from the perspective of public history. And each of you is really thinking about the nature of evidence, its origins, what makes it persuasive, how it's used, some very good, very clear examples of how it's abused, and how it might be better verified. And I think what works really well here is you do move nicely from the abstract to the concrete, right? You give us fascinating subjects that we desperately would need to know more about, right? About the Cleonian Society, a mid-19th century debating society of freed African-American men in Charleston, South Carolina, about 20th century formulations of the Iroquois influence thesis, and then the feelingly omnipresent celebratory and critical commentary on the 21st century presidency of Donald Trump. We have, we're at about 24 minutes. We have 250 of you all in the audience who are going to have questions as well. So maybe I'm just going to ask two sort of questions to all of our panelists to weigh in on two different areas. But I'll ask one first so we don't get too confusing. First, I want to think about, where does audience fit into the arguments that you're making and how we think about evidence? I was really struck by the way in which Professor Ray argues in her paper that in order for evidence to be persuasive, participants must accept it as valid support for the claim it grounds. And so I'm just kind of curious how you all sort of think about that idea. I mean, what does it mean for you to use evidence to write for contemporary audiences? You know, who do you see as your audiences? What do you think they are willing to accept as valid? And how do you reach them? And if you don't, and do you have concerns that there are audiences that potentially fall outside of this dialogue? Those who don't want to identify the evidence that you're using as experts, as scholars, as valid support for the claims that you're making.
Who wants?
Oh, Andrew. Or Angela.
Sure, I can. I'll begin. I think I'm sure all of us have things to say about this. I mean, the conceptualizing or envisioning an audience is always a critical part of, I think, any production of scholarship or other kinds of discourse that's meant to be read broadly. You know, it depends on where I'm publishing my work. It depends on where I'm speaking. It depends on the kinds of contexts in which I would report stories of this kind. My sense, for example, in speaking to this audience is that probably most of the folks in the audience were not from my field. So, you know, a little bit of narration of kind of how I would conceive of audience and how, frankly, I would teach evidence, how I would conceive of evidence, and how I would teach concepts of evidence, say, to undergraduate students was a piece that I plugged in as a kind of framing, as a signal of how I'm thinking about what this scholarship might mean. If I'm talking to school teachers, if I'm talking to people who might find this particular story of particular merit in encouraging young people in our own time, I would probably, you know, walk through more of the information about how I've located this material and what kinds of other studies have been done and what kinds of ways of contextualizing it within various broader frames that I'd try to link to people's own interests. That's a beginning. I could say a lot more, but I'll let my fellow panelists speak.
Yeah, I would just say that, okay, so I just spent all this time flagellating, you know, us historians, but I do think that one of the advantages of history, and I want to second Angela's wise points about, you know, thinking about that we write for different audiences or address different audiences and we do them differently, right? But also, you know, going back to history is one of its strengths is that there is generally a premium on communication, on clear writing, on speaking to wider audiences. So when I mentioned that case of Belisle's article, the fact-checking eventually really came from independent historians and people who, non-specialists, who read it. And of course, many of our sources are still very difficult to access in archives, but increasingly, our sources are digitized and available to a wider public. And so I think that premium on being able to be read by wider audiences and that accessibility to different kinds of evidence that maybe other fields don't have the same kinds of accessibility, maybe give us a little bit more of a check on those areas, on our arguments, maybe then in some other fields, like as was mentioned earlier in the keynote session about a lot of the sciences not really having that premium on clarity of communication, or not everyone being able to run their own nuclear accelerator or whatever. So I think that is something that is a strength of history.
Oh boy.
But Dan disagrees.
Let me second everything that both panelists have said. I'm not sure I have a full handle on the question, but I will say I have spent a lot of time talking to teachers at the middle school and high school level on a subject sometimes controversial, and that is slavery and the cause of the Civil War. And the way I do that is to say, okay, let's look at evidence. And we walk through evidence. And they have no problem following that. Well, let me, Andrew, follow up on your point about confirmation bias, because I was in some very small part one of the guilty parties regarding arming America. I remember when the article that came out in the Journal of American History came out, and I thought it was wonderful. And I sent Belials or Belisiles, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, I sent him an email. I said, thank you, thank you, thank you. And then there was an explosion of criticism of that article and that book, especially on H. Shear. Mm-hmm. And much of that criticism came from people who clearly had a political axe to grind. They were, in a word, gun nuts. Mm-hmm. And the rest of us all dismissed it because, oh, they're just gun nuts. Mm-hmm. And it was only after a long and excruciating process that you had to recognize that the gun nuts were right, you know, that the evidence was in fact made up. And it was for me a very bracing reminder. And now I'm kind of on the other side of it because I say things about Andrew Jackson, you know, he wanted to kill all the Indians. Well, no, it's not that simple. Are you defending him?
Well, and that's
and I've had that conversation a lot.
Well, first of all, I now pronounce you guilty of being human. But also one of the things that I read that, because I've been reading a lot about confirmation bias and how it, you know, comes out in many forms. One of the things that influenced me most thinking about this is a recent article in Ethnography journal called Interpretive, Reflexivity and Ethnography, and it's in the footnotes. And that, so not necessarily, you know, and because you pointed out that, and when I read the article, I agreed with, you know, its implications, as you did. And what Lichterman argues is not for sort of positional reflexivity, which is so hard, but more for us when we encounter arguments, first to think, when we evaluate arguments, first to think, how open am I sort of to this premise? And then depending on that, either to be more generous than we would be if we're skeptical, or to be more skeptical if it's something that we recognize sort of reinforces what we'd like to be true. But you know, reflexivity is something that we all struggle with, and but I think all the scholarship on how poorly our minds work suggests to me that maybe objectivity is not the right thing to try to strive for.
So I think your response, Andy, leads me to the second question I'd like to ask. You know, what I appreciate about your paper, and it comes up very clearly in the long version, so everybody go download it, is that you suggest a way forward, right? And one of the key elements, as you said, is the importance of considering other possible interpretations. And I think one of the questions that raises for me, and maybe people in the audience, is what do we do with interpretations that we don't know are yet even possible? Right? And that, of course, is the classic question of Michel Trio's Silence in the Past. How do we recognize what at certain times and certain spaces can't be conceptualized? And, you know, thinking, what are the things that our own situatedness don't allow us to sort of conceptualize? This is clearly not just an issue for humanists, right? This is an issue for scientists, hard scientists and social scientists. I'm curious how all three of you sort of think about what we do with that. Are there any practices that might help us kind of wrestle with the unknownness?
I think that I'll make one foray here. I think that there is a real advantage in studying history, because studying history, it's easier to see in the situation of others what they could not imagine, what was not yet thinkable. And so that I think that tends to create more awareness for those of us who study the past and teach about the past. And especially you talk to students about what they see in historical material, and they say, well, why didn't they do this or that? And, you know, you take that as a serious question. Then, you know, you notice moments when people had what looked like really ideas really ahead of their time. I mean, those kinds of things help generate an awareness to at least make you more cognizant of the milieu in which you yourself are working. It's hard to know what you don't know. It's hard to know what we can't see if you can't see. but I do think that is a way to train yourself to at least be attentive to that as a critical question.
Yeah, and I would suggest, no, Kyle, that's a great question. And I have to say, my wife read draft of the paper and asked the same question. I still don't have a great answer, although Angela's is a fantastic answer. I mean, part of that is slightly embedded in historical practice because we're taught to address, in our work, we're taught to address the historiography. We're taught to address, previous arguments on a topic. And so that, we're taught in some ways to consider those previous things, but no, I think Angela's right, and I think it's a great question, like how to think through that. I don't have a good answer.
So we have lots of questions here in the Q&A, so I'll stop asking the questions and turn over to them. Let's see, let's start with Dan, a sort of practical question to you. Has anyone ever contacted the Jackson papers to verify quotations or claims? If not, have the staff members of the project ever reached out to those who misquote him or point out the errors? So what is the sort of role of you as the sort of maybe authoritative body or the expert in dealing with this sea of mischaracterization?
Well, that's a good question. First, yes, we have been contacted. Generally, when scholars work on Jackson, they either use our volumes, which is what we want them to do, but they sometimes contact us also. And if you look at like John Meacham's biography of Andrew Jackson or Steve Inskeep's book, Jackson Land, or a number of others, you'll find evidence of the help we've provided to them. It's an interesting question about whether or to what extent we can try to correct a record. And sometimes we do. I'll mention one example when all these stories came out about the censure of Andrew Jackson, and they were trying to turn it into the censure of Donald Trump. And some of them were in the Washington Post, and I contacted the Post editors and I said, this is just wrong. And I got no answer at all. But then we found out where it was, the misinformation was coming from. It was coming from the Senate Historical Office. And so we contacted the Senate Historical Office, and we had an interesting little back and forth as we worked through where the inaccuracies were, and they helped correct themselves. I'll say one more thing, and let me just throw this out there, maybe a kind of an off turning. I do not do social media, and I don't do Twitter, and I don't do Facebook. And one thing that we have noticed over the last, just 3 or 4 years, is that we are contacted much less than we used to be because we're not part of that Twitter and Facebook conversation. And the medium has shifted so much that the public presence that we had before may be declining, and I'm not sure what we should do about that.
Great, thank you. Here's a question for you, Andy, from David Waldstreicher, who asks.
And I know why he's watching this. Hi, David.
Aren't the cases of the Iroquois and Malleable special because they were highly politicized? And don't they, and he suggests, don't they show that the system worked, but that just more intensive peer review happened after publication?
No, that's a great question, and I would suggest that David will send me. We'll have an email conversation later, and he always asks great questions. I would suggest that all the history we do, we understand is ideological, and so rather than these being sort of qualitatively different, these are just sort of at an extreme because they tend to draw more public attention than most ideas or most say journal articles, but they reveal a problem that I have a feeling that if we were to look at a lot of our scholarship, we would find some of these problems in our less controversial cases as well. And again, it's not, you know, I think that's just part of this problem, this contradiction that we live with about being partly, you know, after some sort of truth and partly thinking of ourselves as striving for some kind of objectivity, and it's a, you know, it's a contradiction that without recognizing both of those and having guardrails, we're always going to have these kinds of cases.
Which I think nicely dovetails with a question from Eric Hung, who asks, who benefits from traditional ideas of objectivity in historical thought? And who might potentially be hurt by those traditional ideas?
Wow, that's a great question. I mean, I do think that I do think that partly what they do is create a certain inertia in the field, because it's easy to take what's been previously written as objective because we've you know, because we've accepted it, and that it's been very easy. And in fact, this has come up, a perfect example of this actually has been the historical debate over the 1619 project. And by the way, I think one of the best treatments of that is David Wallstreicher's, I think it's in the Boston Review of Books. But in that some of the lions of the field have criticized that, partly arguing that what they do is history and what other people do is politics. And I think that's actually a pretty good example of how this veneer of objectivity sometimes just reinforces authority.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that? Angela, go ahead.
One thing I was going to say, that one thing that I would notice from the particular project I'm working on now is that one would then ask oneself, so what would an objective reading of this evidence look like? Because I have scraps of things that say lots of different things that are internally contradictory. All of it is quote unquote real. All of it is demonstrably generated at a past moment by someone with you know, who was attempting to codify or do something, attempting to do work in the world, okay? But I can't possibly, so what is my, if I were to say, all right, I've been trained, I want to read this objectively, it's more difficult to see what I could say confidently about what those sources reveal. So, I mean, I would point to that again and sort of reiterate what I was saying earlier, that there are ways in which looking at material that is itself inherently internally contradictory calls into, it makes you think about what kinds of claims you can feasibly make, and, you know, the aspiration towards saying true things and in a way that is responding ethically to the lives that were lived before us is something that I think that it's important to keep in mind. But I don't think that relying on a claim of objectivity helps me do the project, figure out what to say that's true and appropriate and you know, appropriately engaged.
I never use the word objectivity.
Good.
I haven't used it in decades, and if someone would say, well, you use the word truth and facts a whole lot a few minutes ago, I did. And that's, again, when I say that something, for instance, that Jackson did not fight 14 duels, that's a judgment based upon evidence. The evidence is in the paper. Not only do we know the number, well, let's say we know where the number 14 came from and how that number got distorted. To come back to the deeper question, somebody in the earlier panel said, when they were talking about science, said, we're all human, and so we are. And there are things as historians that we want to believe are true. And there are things that we don't want to believe are true. And that's true for us individually, but there's also a kind of consensual. And this relates back to the earlier question of, you know, what kind of things that hadn't occurred to you before are you willing to believe? Well, there are things we're not willing to believe. or that we would require a much higher standard. And yet at the same time, we all think, and this is funny because doing history doing history well starts with the apprehension, the realization that this is not true. And yet we all think that what we think is right, what we think is just, is simply right and just. And so that, for instance, you can read through the Journal of American History, where the articles specialize in problematizing everything, and yet you will see the word justice entirely unproblematically used, because it's obvious that the person you're writing about was seeking justice, not quote justice, unquote, but justice. One thing that is very bracing is to go back and read, let's say, a journal from 50 years ago and see how much of what appeared to be unproblematically true then seems so glaringly not unproblematically true today. And also there's the problem of language. Language changes, and I'll just throw this in. I know a historian, or I knew of a historian, he's no longer living, who in the middle of the 1950s prefaced his book on slavery with what that time was a bold statement of belief in racial equality. And he lived long enough to be accused of not only racism, but sexism for making that statement in language that a generation later seemed wrong.
Using that example, Dan, Andy, you make the argument for greater sort of scholarly reflexivity, right? And you make that, and you do the practice, right? In your when you look at Andy's paper, you see he situates himself in relation to the subject matter. Dan here gives us an example maybe of a 1950s version of that. As we learned in the earlier, heard in the earlier keynote, evidence is not all or none, but requires expert human judgment interpretation. Where do each of you fall on the idea of situating yourself in relation to your own and your field's work? You know, how do you see yourself doing that? And, you know, what sort of practices do you think are best there? Is it, you know, the sort of that the opening, the very first footnote should sort of situate yourself? Is it, should it be explicit? Are there ways in which it should be, it's implicit in the work that you do? Just sort of curious how each of you approach that.
I think it's context dependent. I have published some essays that were for the purpose of narrating a personal experience of deciding on subject matter and how I did the work and so on, and lots of I voice, lots of personal kind of narrative. Frankly, in much of the work that I publish, characteristics of my identity are not the point of what I'm doing, and it is possible, I think, sometimes to put up a screen and make yourself less susceptible to questioning if there's a whole lot of talk about yourself. I think that's an explanation that I've used to explain why I often don't narrate a whole lot of personal stuff about myself and the work I do unless there's some real good reason for doing it. But this is a question students ask me a lot. And they want, in graduate seminars, they really want to talk about this very question. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, I would agree that it depends partly on venue, although I feel like I'm more open, I'm more and more open to it, you know, especially in ways that maybe doesn't, again, going back to this liberal arts idea, that doesn't break narratives that we also want to tell and doesn't insert ourselves too much in our material. But I think also, you know, I think one of our problems in history as practiced in the United States in the academy, is just how little reflexive we are, and maybe just a little bit more in our practices in terms of both how we express ourselves rather than the word of God, but as just, you know, historians trying to make meaning, and also how we, you know, and how we evaluate our work, each other's work might be useful.
I'm not going to say a word on this subject.
Okay. As our final question, this comes from Molly Nebulo, who's one of our long-term fellows in digital humanities at the APS. And she asked about the ways in which memory fits into the idea of evidential standards. Does memory as evidence complicate the way we standardize it? Do you think there are areas for growth needed in the field regarding using memories as evidence? You know, when I read that, when I think about that question, I kind of think, Dan, how much is Jackson that is invoked either pro or con for Trump, in fact, not in fact evidence anymore, but memory of, because these arguments have been going since 1828 or even earlier?
Yeah, I'm not sure memory is exactly the issue there.
Okay.
But certainly it is true, and I think we've all encountered this, and people outside of history encounter it too. It's very difficult to undercut or contradict or question something that everybody knows. And I would say we've reached that with Jackson. Everybody knows that Jackson was A, B, C, or D, based upon what they think Jacksonianism is like. I think a better example of that within my own area of work is again the question of the causes of the Civil War, because you're talking to people about something that they grew up knowing or thinking that they knew, and it's hard to get people to unbelieve what they believe, or to question things that have been unquestioned during their whole lives. And I guess what we've been saying is we are susceptible to that ourselves.
Yeah, no, I would add that it's, oh, Angela, I'm sorry, you were, okay. Just that's a great question, and it's something that I've tried to think about a lot, especially the memory of the founders, and it's, some theorists have put history sort of in opposition to memory, whereas I tend to think that history is one of our practices of memory, and that we have many practices of memory. I mean, earlier we heard from Linda Greenhouse, what is a trial, or what is the law in the United States, common law, except an expression of certain kinds of, like a certain memory practice, right? A certain way of capturing the past to use it for certain purposes. And I do think that, thinking about memory helps us think about some of these issues, and especially helps us think about, like, as Angela pointed out, these silences, and why there are not just what we talk about, but as mentioned by someone mentioned earlier, Trujillo's, work, recapturing why those are silences, either because things are not in the documentary record, or silences in the record themselves.
And I also think that there is a point to be made about history that is trying to narrate what happened at some moment in the past, and then history, like a history of the talk about an event in the past, or a person, and the way that practices of remembering or imagining that something is true or what have you, then take on a life of their own. In listening to this conversation, I've been reminded of Nell Irvin Painter's classic book on Sojourner Truth, which does a beautiful job of both talking about what happened in Sojourner Truth's life, and then talking about how Truth's memory gets deployed in a wide variety of ways for many different purposes across time. That too is it's a form of history making, but it's not a history of the thing, it's a history of the remembrance of the thing and its use. Yeah.
An excellent work, and a wonderful place for us to sort of wrap up our conversation today. Thank you sincerely for all three of you for your wonderful paper and for your conversation today. We resume the conference tomorrow at 1 p.m. Our panel is entitled, How Do We Know? Reading Evidence in the 18th Century. We have 3 fantastic speakers and a comment by Joyce Chaplin of Harvard University. So thank you all, and we will see you tomorrow.